stewarding the health of our children's learning. I don't know how to compress it any more concisely than that, in terms of what must, in my view, be the very center of the mission of parenting and educating. I mean, if you think about it, and I ask you to think about that as we go through the day, is there anything that's more important than stewarding the health of our children's learning? As a parent, is there anything that you can say that's more important than that? I mean, whatever you do, if we deconstruct it, whether you said it was their physical health, or their emotional health, or their nutrition, right? You could go into whether they're taking their supplements. You could go into whatever you wanted to go into. You go into it, we deconstruct it, we'd end up that it comes back to how healthy they're learning their way into being who they're becoming. That learning's on every dimension of being. So we're going to go into that conversation. Before we do, I just want to kind of orient us a bit. Just a reminder, this is a non-linear presentation. I'm not standing up here with a clicker going next slide, next slide. There's hundreds of slides, and I'm kind of feeling my way through what's the best path given what I'm wanting to communicate and what I'm feeling from you. So don't worry if the screen doesn't seem to make sense, in a sequential sense. Okay? Read what's interesting to you, and don't let it bother you or shame you if I move on it before you finish it, okay? I think that the biggest obstacle to our collective learning, if we look at why is it that the literacy problem has been basically flatlined for as long as we've measured it? Right? Why is it we've not making any progress? Why is it that reform after reform after reform in education goes on, and it's kind of impotent? We get all excited. It's the Pygmalion effect, right? We get all excited about we're going to change education, we're going to change the way we teach, and some new thing comes along, and we rush to get on the bandwagon of that. And 2 years later, the spike died. We're back to flatline, waiting for the next thing, and off goes Flexo. I kind of think of education reform like rearranging the litter box and expecting a new kind of cat to come out of it. Right? It's pretty important stuff. And I think the reason that it is that it's fundamentally misoriented. It's very intention. What it's trying to bring forth in children is fundamentally misoriented and actually learning disabling. And then ultimately what we've got to do, and I say this without meaning to in any way blame anybody. Right? This is nobody's fault. This is just a transmission of history, what it looks like right here, right now. It's never been right. It's just been more compatible with the times that we were living in. And that at the core of our difficulties is really our assumptions, the way we think about things. I want to be careful.
Yes.
Somebody apparently once went up to the great philosopher Wittgenstein and said, what a lot of morons people back in the Middle Ages must have been to have looked every morning at what's going on behind me now, the dawn, and to have thought that what they were seeing was the sun going around the earth. Well, as every school kid knows, the earth goes around the sun, and it doesn't take too many brains to understand that. To which Wittgenstein replied, yeah, but I wonder what it would have looked like if the sun had been going around the earth. Point being, of course, it would have looked exactly the same. You see what your knowledge tells you you're seeing.
Our biggest problem is that we think we know. We're always bumping into, we think we know. It's not just the kind of crude layers of society, right, and social functions that think this way. This goes right to rocket science. This goes right to the edge and state of the art of every science. From Edison saying that AC power was going to fry all our brains, and we should never have it, everything should be DC, to Frank Sinatra saying rock and roll will never amount to anything, right? To the president and chair of the board of Kodak being approached by one of its employees saying, we got this idea of photographing pieces of paper. Right? And they say, what's that? And then watching the Xerox tower block their view of the river. Right? Or the railroad companies saying, nobody wants to have a personal railroad. And not investing in the auto industry. Right? Two of my favorites that are a little bit more graphic, which I'm going to be careful with, is during the Middle Ages, we had the greatest scientists of the day believed that the Great Plagues were caused by a planetary misalignment that shifted the atmospherics on Earth and caused a miasma, a bad smell in the atmosphere. And it was this bad smell that was causing the plague. And so throughout the Middle Ages, you see people walking around basically with incense burners or these incense burning helmets, right? Because they believed that if they changed the smell, then they wouldn't get sick. This was state-of-the-art science. They believed this stuff. I showed at some horror and dismay on Thursday night a video of lobotomy. Right? There was a time in my lifetime where a guy won the Nobel Prize for sticking an ice pick inside people's eye socket and tearing up the front of their brain, right? Because that was state-of-the-art, liberating neuroscience, right? Of how to change the behavior of even kids that were out of control. We always think we know, and what we think we know interferes with our learning. The first step in learning anything is to suspend our assumptions, to suspend our certainty. Certainty is implicitly learning disabling. It can be learning enabling when it's right? Like scaffolding. But it can be incredibly misleading and disabling when it's wrong. And the problem with our assumptions is that they're typically invisible to us. We take them for granted. Just like all these things. And again, this isn't related to just old stories of the Middle Ages, like burning witches. People used to gather around and watch somebody being burned on the stake and actually experience that as if we're doing that person's soul a favor. So rather than having the horrific reaction that we would have, they were thinking they were doing this person something, doing good for this person. Right? So again, mental frame of reference, the mental lenses we see through and think through, that's the starting point. This is a couple of recent examples. First, physics.
A century ago, some scientists thought they had pretty much figured out the basic laws of the universe. Far from confirming that we had sorted it all out, the 20th century showed that every time we looked more closely at the universe, we discovered yet another unexpected layer of reality.
There again, and this is physics, right? This is the science of science that all other sciences kind of plug into at one level or another. We continue to discover that what we were so certain was the way things are turns out to be a gross approximation. Right? You can't get to Einstein from Newton. You can't get to quantum mechanics from the billiard balls of classical mechanics. Right? And it goes on and on and on. This is a recent example that shows that it's not just... Do you remember the Hubble Space Telescope? You remember that they had all the problems with it that turned out to be the metric English conversions? I mean, we're constantly making mistakes. This is one of my favorite examples of recent science operations, science and technology and money. It goes on and on and on, right? So why I'm bringing all this up is just to say, let's just temporarily park our assumptions and go on a ride into learning, right? That recognize that our assumptions are they can be helpful and they can be misleading, and it's very difficult for us to know which it is, most of the time. So you heard Reed yesterday talk, those of you who were here, about magic bullets, how one of our big problems is magic bullets. I couldn't agree more. When we're searching for magic bullets, we're really misoriented. I want to say, forget about magic bullets, let's start looking for magic glasses. What we need is to be able to see the situation, rather than arguing about what to do to fix it. Our common problem is to use a baseball analogy, we're trying to throw the ball we never caught in the first place. We need to take time to kind of catch the thing, right? We need to take time to really bring it home to understand what we're talking about before we go racing off to action. Right? The bullet approach is oriented towards quick action. Right? The glasses approach is oriented towards kind of learning our way deeper into understanding. And my basic point, more than anything, is learn your way in. My core premise is, rather than arguing about which particular methodology or product or ideology or guru or which system of thought to be a subscriber to or a conscript to, right? Become a first-person learner. Learn your way in for yourself. So your understanding is kind of grounded not in some reference loop to, well, I know this because some expert I believe in said so. I know this because I've got some intricate conceptual model in my head that says this must be so. But did you actually become a kind of first-person learning scientist in your own right? That you're paying attention to your own learning. I mean, ultimately, particularly for those of us that work with kids, either directly as parents or as educators, what do we most want to model for kids? How to be a machine? There's machines all around in the world today, right? They can be machines much better than we can be. We want to model for them being a great learner, learning all the time, being learning-oriented in what we're doing, and how we're interrelating, how we're conversing, how we're dialoguing, how we're finding our way to be kind of on the edge with what they're doing. Right? And the good news is, each of us has the most fantastic learning library, learning environment, experimental learning environment in the known universe, walking around with us inside our own skins every day. You don't need to have some expert tell you about what learning is if you start paying attention to your own learning. Right? If you start paying attention to your own learning, in other words, how is it your attention moves around? How is it that your learning really engages? What causes your learning to stutter? What causes your learning to drift off of focus? Right? Drift out of staying engaged in what you were originally interested in. Each of us are living lives that exhibit all of the core phenomena that we need to learn about learning. You are all cases that can, as you unpack it and think about it and observe yourself, you are evidence of healthy learning, where learning has created a scaffolding for you, where learning has created an opportunity for you to keep learning and extending. And you also have, and this is really key, each of us has inside of us evidence of unhealthy learning. Aspects of our personality, our cognitive function, our linguistic abilities, our social, emotional, relationship capacities that are skewed, stunted, blunted by what we've learned. We are all these kind of walking laboratories. And what I'm trying to say is that while it's important to follow what the experts have to say, let's remember that for the most part, the experts are looking at this thing from the outside. right? They're looking at human beings from an outside perspective according to the various measurements they can make, right? For the most part, educational research is kind of like yield analysis on crops, right? You do this, or one of the analogies I like is Renaissance cannon fire, right? And how you fire the missile, and you measure where the poof comes up, and then you recalibrate the cannon, and you fire it again until you learn how to hit the target with the cannon. Right? I go to a neuroscience conference, and I'm speaking with a bunch of neuroscientists, and I'm listening to them go on and on and on, rightfully so and importantly so, about all these distinctions we can make about what we can see about what the brain's doing. All of this is very helpful. But we can't lose sight of the fact there's a being in the brain. There's a participant in the brain. And it's how well the participant participates. Everything comes down to that. In your life and in the life of everybody you're trying to help. How well does the being in the brain participate? How well does the learner participate? Learn to learn from the inside out in the course of what they're doing. And how do you become stewards of that process? Those are the questions we're going to get into. And so, just to summarize this particular point, I don't want to throw out the experts. I want to use them. But I want it to be kind of the library that's informing the learning journey that's coming from the inside out in our first-person experience. Not a substitute for. When it becomes a substitute for, then we become robotic conscripts. We become robotic executioners of a protocol, a way of doing things. And what does that do? It cuts out our learning, and it causes us to model for the kids a kind of mechanistic way of being, which is the last thing in the world they need to get. The thing that can be most helpful to them is to actually be in the presence of somebody who's exhibiting live, juicy learning. So, there's no substitute for your first-person learning, right? Anybody want to go into that? Any disagreements? I know that's kind of putting you on the spot, but think about that. If you do, if you're somewhere inside yourself, you're going, yeah, but, right? Then come forth with it. If you can't, then ask yourself, why can't you? Because that's also a conversation about unhealthy learning.